Y'all remember that? You don't remember that? When you would, what would they say? They'd fold up the streets on Sundays because there wasn't nothing open. Roll up the sidewalks. I mean, for the people who remember that, did you have any complaints about it back then? Or it was just a normal thing, wasn't it? Find a store.
Or you go to the store and knock on the door and say, "Could you get me something out of the store?"
Yeah.
You do that at their house.
Yeah, a lot of people lived upstairs or whatever, didn't they, over their stores and stuff back then. Yeah. But, yeah, I remember that, you know, when a lot of things, especially restaurants, there wasn't no restaurants open on Sunday. I mean, everybody closed and took a day off. That's kind of what we're looking at this morning. Cook on Saturday. Yeah. Yeah, and picnic on Sunday. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, just go to Cracker Barrel this morning. See how many people shows up between 6 and 11 or 12. But that's what we're studying about today. We're studying about the Old Testament again. In Exodus 31, verse 12 through 17 is the text. But it says, most of us live in a culture that is poles apart from what we see in the Old Testament regarding the Sabbath observance. Whereas the Israelites often tended to take God's already stringent Sabbath commandments to a legalistic extreme, today's society has abandoned any concern whatsoever to set a day aside to honor God. Whatsoever. And I believe that. I mean, I really do. It says the society today don't set a day aside just to honor God. I mean, all of us are probably guilty of working on Sunday, right? I mean, we've all, you know, something we've had to do in the past or, you know, whatever the case might be. But it would be a good idea if we did set aside the Sabbath day, or today is what we call Sunday, not the Sabbath day, but the first day of the week, to honor God today, wouldn't it? Just to take time out and say, you know, I appreciate everything you've done for me, and this is your day. I mean, it said that the Israelites took the already stringent Sabbath command, as we'll get into, to a legalistic extreme. Does anything stand out in the Bible to you that the Jews did during the time of Jesus where he said, that's just going way overboard? You remember anything? Anything that happened? You remember when he was walking through the field and he plucked the wheat? And they said, you can't do that. You can't pluck wheat on Sunday. That's working. We got to eat, don't you? Is eating work? It is for me. If you see me eat, you'd think it's a lot of work. But, you know, Jesus told them, said, look, you're taking it to extreme. Here you are with all these legalistic matters, these things that you can't do, and you've got widows that are starving to death. You should be more concerned about them than you are about plucking grain on a Sunday. I think we've got to that message before. But the scripture, Exodus 31:12, I want you to notice how stringent God is here. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, verily, my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between who? Me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that does sanctify you. So why did he set the Sabbath, wanted them to keep the Sabbath? He said it's a sign between me and you, and for your children and their children, that you may know what? I am the Lord that does sanctify you. So that's why we have the Sabbath day. That's God's reasoning behind having the Sabbath day in place for the Israelites to let them know that he is the Lord. That's a pretty important thing, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of the way we need to be this morning here on Sunday. As why are we here to worship God? Because he is the Lord that do sanctify us. Ye shall keep my Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone, notice how stringent this is. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. I mean, what kind of God is this? I mean, wait a minute. He said, listen, this is so important that I want you to tell the people of Israel that if they do not observe my day, my Sabbath day that I have put aside for them to rest and worship me, I want you to kill them. Kill them. That's pretty strict, isn't it? He says, the reason I want you to do this is because I want you and your generations to know that I am God, and I mean what I say. And he said, you shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy unto you. It's not holy unto God, it's holy unto you. Every one that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doth any work therein on the Sabbath day, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may your work be done. But in the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel for how long? Forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. And he gave Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon the Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with whose finger? Written with God's finger.
You know, when you do the Sabbath and you rest on that day, you're actually refurbishing your body.
Right.
Because, you know, you're not doing letting the dishwasher, you're not doing this, you're not loading clothes.
You're not doing.
You're just one-on-one with the Lord. And that's what he wants us to do.
Is it so we can just be lazy? Is that why he told us not to do that, or why he told the children of Israel? No, it wasn't for that reason. It was like you said, it was to worship God. It was God's hope. We can do anything we wanted to do those 6 days of the week, but
Well, we're so busy that all the other stuff we got to do, we think, oh, we are being lazy.
are we under the law today to keep the Sabbath? No, we're not. We're to recognize God's day of it. All right. Is it just one of them that's bad? Bottom one? Oh, good. Must have had a date on it. That's what it was. But, I mean, you know, you stop and think about it. This is... How many times did God had to kill people? I mean, if you look through the Old Testament, do you know how many times God himself put people to death? And we're under grace. Thank God for grace. I mean, he said if you work on the Sabbath day, you're to be put to death. If you don't recognize the Sabbath as a holy day to worship me, you're to be put to death. It don't get much stricter than death. So how should we view today? How should we view the day that we choose to worship God? Shouldn't we look at it as a holy day? I mean, when I got to studying this morning, it makes you realize that we serve a God who means what He says. And sometimes we take that for granted that he don't really mean what He says. But we're going to stand before Him one day, and we're going to understand really quick that what He said He meant. It says earlier in the book of Exodus, the Lord had given what we commonly call the Ten Commandments, or the tables of stone. One of those commandments related to the Sabbath, or the seventh day of the week. In our text for this week, the Lord reiterated and reinforced the regulation of the Mosaic covenant. See, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the Mosaic covenant. The command was, verily, my Sabbaths ye shall keep. That was the commandment. The keeping of the Sabbath was not merely an outward action. Rather, the Lord said it was to be a sign. Remember, that's what it was. It was a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know what? That I am the Lord, and thus sanctify you. Remember, out of all of the people on the face of the planet during the days of the children of Israel, they were His chosen nation. It wasn't the Gentiles, it wasn't the Egyptians, it wasn't the Middle Easterns, the Far Easterners, or the Westerners, or anybody else that happened to be alive during that day. It was the offspring of Abraham that was called to be the children of God, and they had strict guidelines to follow. And why did they have those strict guidelines to follow? It was to show the rest of the world that they were different and they belonged to God and no one else. So, should we not be a little different than the world as being Christians? It says the keeping of the Sabbath was an outward action. Observing it was a weekly reminder that God had sanctified His children and set them apart as a nation, and they were His own people. He told Abraham, your offspring will be my people. My people. God's people. So where did that leave everybody else? Where does that leave everybody today that does not know Jesus Christ? What are they? Well, they're not God's people. They're not God's children. That's our job, is to encourage them to become part of God's children, to become part of the family. I mean, there's a lot of people that's on the outside of the family right now. And if you had some family members that had gone astray, wouldn't it be a good thing to be talking to them about coming back to the family? Because what happens? I mean, we're talking about life or death now. We're not talking about money. We're not talking about health. We're not talking about status. We're not talking about things that really don't matter in this life. We're talking about life or death. The regulations of the Sabbath day was a holy time for the Jewish nation. Was there any other people on the face of the earth during the time of the nation of Israel that set aside a whole day and called it holy and worshiped their God? Not that we know of. God set the standard for this. but it was a holy time. It was a very important part of the relationship with God. Would you consider church to be a very important relationship with God? Are you part of the church? See, if you're a child of Jesus Christ, or a child of God and an heir with Jesus Christ, you are the church. You're part of the church. So how important is that? Well, the Bible tells us that the church is the bride of Christ. How important is the bride of Christ? Well, it's so important that one day Christ is coming to get who? He's coming to get the bride. Do you want to be involved in that? Do you want to have a place at the table of the feast of the wedding? I mean, this is a literal marriage between the bride and Christ. And you can be a part of that. You can be served at the table, at the feast, as a guest. And guess who's going to be serving you? I mean, that's a big deal. When Jesus himself is serving you. He's already served you one time. He came as a servant to serve. Jesus came to die a horrific death for you. Don't that make you just a little bit appreciative of what he did? Not only that, he said, listen, if you follow me and you put your trust and faith in me, I'll come back and get you and I'll take you where I'm at. Not only that, I will prepare a table, a feast. And not only that, I'll serve you when you get there. That's crazy that somebody would do that for you. No other. But here we are. We have that opportunity. I mean, there is going to be a heavenly home for each and every one of us who put our faith in Christ. See, the Jews was promised an earthly home, an earthly kingdom to be the children of God. Well, we've got something far better than that. We can be with him. The basis for working the 6 days and resting one day is found in the Lord's creation work. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 described how the Lord worked 6 days and rested one. He wanted his people to do the same to show that they were set apart to him. Our passage concludes by mentioning that 2 tablets of stone that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. What happened to the first 2 tablets of stone that God ripped with his finger? Do you remember? When they got broke, didn't they? Who broke them? Did God break them? You remember the story? When Moses came down off Sinai and he found the children of Israel had made what? They had made their own god out of the gold that the children of Israel had brought out of the land of Egypt, and he formed it into a what? A calf. And then he lied. Aaron lied about it. Moses broke the tables. He had to go back and get a second set. It says the Sabbath command was still an important part of the Jewish life. Today it still is. It was a perpetual sign of the Mosaic covenant. However, Sabbath observance is not a binding regulation for the new covenant, because Christ was resurrected on the first day of the week, we now observe Sunday as the Lord's special day in the Christian calendar. Next week, we will look at how God's people are to obey Him dealing with their neighbors. This is going to be interesting. Particularly showing them love. We get to look at our neighbors next week, how we treat them. But the text is obedience in rest is the title of this message for this week. Obedience in rest. It says the book of Exodus opens up with the people of Israel having suffered as Egyptian slaves for centuries. How many years was the children of Israel in bondage in Egypt? Anybody remember? 400 plus years. There was people who were born as slaves. They were slaves their entire life, and they died as slaves, never knowing anything but being a slave in the land of Egypt. What a way to live. They never knew God. They never knew the covenants that God would make with their ancestors in the future. They were just born a slave, raised a slave, and died a slave. And here we are this morning, far from being a slave. We got so much to be thankful for. I mean, we get to choose today what we're going to have for a meal. We can choose A, B, C, D, whatever you can afford to choose. Could you imagine being raised in Egypt during those days? It says, Israel left the land of their oppressors and headed toward the land of promise to Abraham and his seed. Encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai, Israel received not only the Ten Commandments, but also many other laws and regulations, both civil and ceremonial. They were also given detailed instructions concerning the tabernacle. Remember, we studied about that a few weeks ago, how they were to construct the tabernacle, in what order, and what materials to use, and which way it should face, and how it should be torn down, and how it should be carried, and how it should be put back together, and how the 12 tribes of Israel were to be laid out among, because the tabernacle was in the middle, facing a certain direction, and all of this had to be done in order. And every time they would move, they would have to repeat this process in order. God is a God of order, not of disorder. It says both civil and ceremonial laws were given. They were given detailed instructions, a portable sanctuary that could be moved as they made their way toward the land of Canaan. And as part of the Decalogue, the commandment to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy was the most important. It was recognized from the very beginning of Israel's history as vitally important. This, no doubt, is one of the reasons that the Pharisees in the times of Christ was obsessed with its meticulous observances. You know, Jesus complained to them that they were so stringent on the laws that they forgot to take care of the people. They've got so involved in the traditions of man that they forgot about God. You know, there's a lot of churches like that today. They're so concerned with the traditions of their denomination and their forefathers that they forget about God and love and empathy and concern and charity. There's a lot of them that all they want to do is show. It's a show. That's a sad situation. They started out as one thing, and then they wound up as something else. While the first commandments given to Moses were primarily moral and ethical, or moral and ethical, the next instructions were related to Israel's worship. This included details concerning the construction of the tabernacle, the office of the priest, this section of Exodus comes to the end. More details are given about the observance of Sabbath. And the number one question in your book says, what is the primary meaning of the word Sabbath? Anybody know? What is the primary meaning of the word Sabbath? It says, since the Hebrew word translated Sabbath comes from the word meaning to stop or cease, the concept of refraining from ordinary work was inherent in the very word chosen for this commandment, the Sabbath, to stop or cease from doing something. That's where the word Sabbath came from. The number two question says, how was the Sabbath a sign between Israel and God? How was it a sign? It says, the Sabbath is a sign between me and you, as brought out in 31:13. It's for me and you throughout your generations. Although there are similarities between Israel's law and other ancient moral codes, the Sabbath law was unique to Israel. No other people had the Sabbath law except for the children of Israel. We're going to be observing something tonight. If you've read your bulletin this morning, what is it we're going to be observing? The what? The Lord's Supper. And why do we do that? What's the purpose behind it? Is that your salvation? Does that help get you saved? Come on, somebody, anybody? No, it don't. It don't help get you saved. It's not part of your salvation. What does it say? Do in remembrance of me. The same way as the Sabbath was for the children of Israel, it's when we take of the Lord's Supper, what are we doing it for? In remembrance of Christ and what He did for us. We're drinking of the blood and eating of the flesh, which a lot of people see as, I don't know if I want to do that or not. The Catholic take it to a different level, but we won't get into that. That's a different study for a different day. But we're going to be doing that. And what's the other observance that we have in our denomination is our tradition that we do besides the Lord's Supper? There's one more. Baptism. Is baptism part of your salvation? No, it's not. Why do we get baptized? It's an observance. But I do like what it said there in the beginning. It says, the introduction of the lesson, that most of us live in a culture that pulls apart from what we see in the Old Testament. It says, whereas the Israelites tended to take God's stringent Sabbath commandments to a different level, today's society has abandoned it altogether. You say, what'd you do last Sunday? Well, I took a day off and honored God. You don't hear anybody saying that, do you? That's just not what we say anymore. We took a day and honored God. What if the consequences was as serious today as it was during the days of the children of Israel out of Egypt when they were wandering around in the desert? What if God said, if you're not in church Sunday morning, I'm going to kill you? I believe we'd be here, wouldn't we? Well, I'm sorry, but my car broke down. He didn't say, I don't care if your car broke down. He said, if you're not at church, I'm going to kill you. Well, it's an amazing thing that we have grace, isn't it? It's an amazing thing that we can come up with excuses and God will forgive us for it, isn't it? How many of you had to ask for forgiveness this month? Have you done anything that you need to be forgiven for? What if God said, if you do it again, I'm going to kill you? Thank God for grace. What's changed? If you don't go out and at least attempt to give someone the gospel next week, there's going to be serious consequences to follow. Would that help you get out and give the gospel to somebody? Is there serious consequences to people you don't share the gospel to? What's the worst that could happen? They could die and go to hell. That's the worst that could happen. Is that not a motivator? I mean, is it not our responsibility to share the gospel? When you start looking at the seriousness of the effects of not doing something, it's no different than God saying, if you're not here Sunday morning, I'm going to kill you. Well, if they don't receive Christ, what's going to happen to them? I mean, this is life or death. Where's our part in it? Do we not share the responsibility? It's a sacred duty. There's going to be some veterans that'll be honored today. Some that are still with us, and some that have passed on many, many, many years ago. But there's one thing for certain, that each one of those veterans will tell you that if their commanding officer was standing in front of them and gave them a direct order, would they say, no, I don't think I want to do that today? Well, I don't think so. Because most likely what would happen? There'd be some consequences for it. That's the way we need to look at our duty. There could be some consequences for it. There will be some consequences for it. A couple of practical points, and we'll call it an early day because everybody wants to look at this beautiful Christmas tree back here. So, good looking tree, isn't it? When we're finished with it this year, we'll just take it on to the house. It says, God makes his expectations clear to all men. Remember, and I think it's Romans chapter 6, chapter 5, where Paul says, there is no excuse anymore for not believing in God. No excuse for not believing in God. He showed you from the foundation of the earth, by looking at the stars, by looking at the moon, by looking at all the things that I have created, you're without excuse, old man. But still we have people who use that excuse as, I don't believe in God. But he makes his expectations clear to all men that he does exist. Not only that, he makes his expectations clear in his word that he gives us. He gives us a clear outline and a picture of his thoughts and his mind. And he gives us the instructions that we need to follow to do the things that makes him happy. For when it's all said and done, it's God's will be done, not ours. As God's people, we live set apart for his purposes. Through the principle of the Sabbath, God teaches believers to depend on him. Who are you depending on? You depending on him, or are you depending on yourself? Or are you depending on the government? Or are you depending on other people? I tend to believe on myself more than anybody, don't you? I mean, that's just the way I'm geared. I said, well, I'll get it done some way or another. I'll figure it out some way. There's been a few times that when I couldn't figure it out, I had to depend on God. I said, God, I can't do that. I can't figure this one out. I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, well, just believe. Believe what I'm telling you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. I'll go all the way to the ends of the earth. Believers must teach the next generation to know, worship, and obey God. Do you see yet that being done on a major scale today, that we're teaching the next generation about God? I mean, I don't know what the ratio is because we don't have many young children here, but are children filling the churches? Are they being taught about God? Who's going to teach them? God's people are renewed through worship and strengthened as they remember who he is and what he has done. And number 6, the most important one, man's standards. Well, I'll tell you what, after watching all these elections last week, there's not many standards left. I hate to say it, but this country is in a world of hurt. You know that? It seems that we are divided right down the middle, 50-50. We got one side, the other side, and it's an awful mess. But man's standards can change from day to day, but God's will always endures. It always endures. Someone has said that our great-grandfathers called it the Holy Sabbath. Our grandfathers called it the Sabbath. Our fathers called it Sunday meeting. But we call it the weekend. Everybody's waiting on the weekend, ain't they? Although the Sabbath was given only to Israel and Sunday was never meant to be observed in exactly the same way, we have indeed substituted the holiday for the holy day, recreation for reverence, games for godliness, and dissipation for devotion. I like the way they put that. We don't call it the Sabbath, we call it the weekend. Good stuff right there. So today, when the pastor is giving us the bread of life, the message from the Holy Scriptures, maybe we can take just a minute. So, well, today is a holy day. It's a special day for us as Christians. We need to take advantage of it. We need to worship God. We need to forget about everything